Chapter 12 of Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Simonon, Vallejo, California. Chapter 12. Abraham Lincoln and his Cabinet. Daily intercourse with Lincoln, the great civil leaders of the period, Seward and Chase, Gideon Welles, friction between Stanton and Blair, personal traits of the President, Lincoln's surpassing ability as a politician, his true greatness of character and intellect, his genius for military judgment, Stanton's comment on the Gettysburg speech, the kindness of Abraham Lincoln's heart. During the first winter I spent in Washington in the War Department, I had constant opportunities of seeing Mr. Lincoln and of conversing with him in the cordial and unofficial manner which he always preferred. Not that there was ever any lack of dignity in the man. Even in his freest moments, one always felt the presence of a will and of an intellectual power which maintained the ascendancy of his position. He never posed or put on airs, or attempted to make any particular impression, but he was always conscious of his own ideas and purposes, even in his most unreserved moments. I knew, too, and saw frequently all the members of his cabinet. When Mr. Lincoln was inaugurated as president, his first act was to name his cabinet, and it was a common remark at the time that he had put into it every man who had competed with him for the nomination. The first in importance was William H. Seward of New York, Mr. Lincoln's most prominent competitor. Mr. Seward was made Secretary of State. He was an interesting man of an optimistic temperament, and he probably had the most cultivated and comprehensive intellect in the administration. He was a man who was all his life in controversies, yet he was singular in this that, though forever in fights, he had almost no personal enemies. Seward had great ability as a writer, and he had what is very rare in a lawyer, a politician, or a statesman, imagination. A fine illustration of his genius was the acquisition of Alaska. This was one of the last things that he did before he went out of office, and it demonstrated more than anything else his fixed and never-changing idea that all North America should be united under one government. Mr. Seward was an admirable writer and an impressive, though entirely unpretentious speaker. He stood up and talked as though he were engaged in conversation, and the effect was always great. It gave the impression of a man deliberating out loud with himself. The second man in importance and ability to be put into the cabinet was Mr. Chase of Ohio. He was an able, noble, spotless statesman, a man who would have been worthy of the best days of the old Roman Republic. He had been a candidate for the presidency, though a less conspicuous one than Seward. Mr. Chase was a portly man, tall and of an impressive appearance, with a very handsome large head. He was genial, though very decided, and occasionally he would criticize the president, a thing I never heard Mr. Seward do. Chase had been successful in Ohio politics, and in the Treasury Department his administration was satisfactory to the public. He was the author of the national banking law. I remember going to dine with him one day. I did that pretty often, as I had known him well when I was on the Tribune, and he said to me, "I have completed today a very great thing. I have finished the National Bank Act. It will be a blessing to the country long after I am dead." The Secretary of the Navy throughout the war was Gideon Welles of Connecticut. Welles was a curious-looking man. He wore a wig which was parted in the middle, the hair falling down on each side, and it was from his peculiar appearance, I have always thought, that the idea that he was an old fogey originated. I remember Governor Andrew of Massachusetts coming into my office at the War Department one day and asking where he could find that old Mormon deacon, the Secretary of the Navy. In spite of his peculiarities, I think Mr. Wells was a very wise, strong man. There was nothing decorative about him. There was no noise in the street when he went along, but he understood his duty and did it efficiently, continually, and unvaryingly. There was a good deal of opposition to him, for we had no navy when the war began, and he had to create one without much deliberation. But he was patient, laborious, and intelligent at his task. Montgomery Blair was Postmaster General in Mr. Lincoln's cabinet. He was a capable man, sharp, keen, perhaps a little cranky, and not friendly with everybody, but I always found him pleasant to deal with, and I saw a great deal of him. He and Mr. Stanton were not very good friends, and when he wanted anything in the War Department, he was more likely to come to an old friend like me than to go to the Secretary. Stanton, too, rather preferred that. The Attorney General of the Cabinet was Edward Bates of Missouri. Bates had been Mr. Greeley's favorite candidate for the presidency. He was put into the cabinet partly, I suppose, because his reputation was good as a lawyer, but principally because he had been advocated for president by such powerful influences. Bates must have been about 68 years old when he was appointed Attorney General. He was a very eloquent speaker. Give him a patriotic subject when his feelings could expand, and he would make a beautiful speech. He was a man of very gentle, cordial nature, but not one of extraordinary brilliancy. The relations between Mr. Lincoln and the members of his cabinet were always friendly and sincere on his part. He treated every one of them with unvarying candor, respect, and kindness. But though several of them were men of extraordinary force and self-assertion, this was true especially of Mr. Seward, Mr. Chase, and Mr. Stanton, and though there was nothing of selfhood or domination in his manner toward them, it was always plain that he was the master and they the subordinates. They constantly had to yield to his will in questions where responsibility fell upon him. If he ever yielded to theirs, it was because they convinced him that the course they advised was judicious and appropriate. I fancied during the whole time of my intimate intercourse with him and with them that he was always prepared to receive the resignation of any one of them. At the same time, I do not recollect a single occasion when any member of the cabinet had got his mind ready to quit his post from any feeling of dissatisfaction with the policy or conduct of the president. Not that they were always satisfied with his actions. The members of the cabinet, like human beings in general, were not pleased with everything. In their judgment, much was imperfect in the administration. Much they felt would have been done better if their views had been adopted and they individually had had charge of it. Not so with the president. He was calm, equable, uncomplaining. In the discussion of important questions, whatever he said showed the profoundest thought, even when he was joking. He seemed to see every side of every question. He never was impatient, he never was in a hurry, and he never tried to hurry anybody else. To everyone he was pleasant and cordial, yet they all felt it was his word that went at last, that every case was open until he gave his decision. This impression of authority, of reserve force, Mr. Lincoln always gave to those about him. Even physically he was impressive. According to the record measurements, he was 6 feet 4 inches in height. That is, he was at least 4 inches taller than the tall ordinary man. When he rode out on horseback to review an army, as I have frequently seen him do, he wore usually a high hat, and then he looked like a giant. There was no waste or excess of material about his frame. Nevertheless, he was very strong and muscular. I remember that the last time I went to see him at the White House, the afternoon before he was killed, I found him in a side room with coat off and sleeves rolled up, washing his hands. He had finished his work for the day and was going away. I noticed then the thinness of his arms and how well developed, strong, and active his muscles seemed to be. In fact, there was nothing flabby or feeble about Mr. Lincoln physically. He was a very quick man in his movements, when he chose to be, and he had immense physical endurance. Night after night he would work, late and hard, without being wilted by it, and he always seemed as ready for the next day's work as though he had done nothing the day before. Mr. Lincoln's face was thin and his features were large. His hair was black, his eyebrows heavy, his forehead square and well developed. His complexion was dark and quite sallow. His smile was something most lovely. I have never seen a woman's smile that approached it in its engaging quality, nor have I ever seen another face which would light up as Mr. Lincoln's did when something touched his heart or amused him. I have heard it said that he was ungainly, that his step was awkward. He never impressed me as being awkward. In the first place, there was such a charm and beauty about his expression, such good humor and friendly spirit looking from his eyes, that when you were near him you never thought about whether he was awkward or graceful. You thought of nothing except, what a kindly character this man has. Then, too, there was such a shrewdness in his kindly features that one did not care to criticize him. His manner was always dignified, and even if he had done an awkward thing, the dignity of his character and manner would have made it seem graceful and becoming. The great quality of his appearance was benevolence and benignity, the wish to do somebody some good if he could. And yet there was no flabby philanthropy about Abraham Lincoln. He was all solid, hard, keen intelligence, combined with goodness. Indeed, the expression of his face and of his bearing which impressed one most, after his benevolence and benignity, was his intelligent understanding. You felt that here was a man who saw through things, who understood, and you respected him accordingly. Lincoln was a supreme politician. He understood politics because he understood human nature. I had an illustration of this in the spring of 1864. The administration had decided that the Constitution of the United States should be amended so that slavery should be prohibited. This was not only a change in our national policy, it was also a most important military measure. It was intended not merely as a means of abolishing slavery forever, but as a means of affecting the judgment and the feelings and the anticipations of those in rebellion. It was believed that such an amendment to the Constitution would be equivalent to new armies in the field, that it would be worth at least 1,000,000 men, that it would be an intellectual army that would tend to paralyze the enemy and break the continuity of his ideas. In order to amend the Constitution, it was necessary first to have the proposed amendment approved by 3/4 of the states. When that question came to be considered, the issue was seen to be so close that one state more was necessary. The state of Nevada was organized and admitted into the Union to answer that purpose. I have sometimes heard people complain of Nevada as superfluous and petty, not big enough to be a state. But when I hear that complaint, I always hear Abraham Lincoln saying, "It is easier to admit Nevada than to raise another 1,000,000 of soldiers." In March 1864, the question of allowing Nevada to form a state government finally came up in the House of Representatives. There was strong opposition to it. For a long time beforehand, the question had been canvassed anxiously. At last, late one afternoon, the president came into my office on the 3rd story of the War Department. He used to come there sometimes rather than send for me because he was fond of walking and liked to get away from the crowds in the White House. He came in and shut the door. "Dana," he said, "I am very anxious about this vote. It has got to be taken next week. The time is very short. It is going to be a great deal closer than I wish it was." There are plenty of Democrats who will vote for it, I replied. There is James E. English of Connecticut. I think he is sure, isn't he? Oh, yes, he is sure on the merits of the question. Then, said I, there's Sunset Cox of Ohio. How is he? He is sure and fearless, but there are some others that I am not clear about. There are three that you can deal with better than anybody else, perhaps, as you know them all. I wish you would send for them. He told me who they were. It isn't necessary to repeat the names here. One man was from New Jersey, and two from New York. What will they be likely to want? I asked. I don't know, said the president. I don't know. It makes no difference, though, what they want. Here is the alternative, that we carry this vote or be compelled to raise another 1,000,000, and I don't know how many more men, and fight no one knows how long. It's a question of 3 votes or new armies. Well, sir, said I, what shall I say to these gentlemen? I don't know, said he, but whatever promises you make to them, I will perform. I sent for the men and saw them one by one. I found that they were afraid of their party. They said that some fellows in the party would be down on them. 2 of them wanted Internal Revenue collectors' appointments. You shall have it, I said. Another one wanted a very important appointment about the Custom House of New York. I knew the man well whom he wanted to have appointed. He was a Republican, though the congressman was a Democrat. I had served with him in the Republican County Committee of New York. The office was worth perhaps $20,000 a year. When the congressman stated the case, I asked him, "Do you want that?" "Yes," said he. "Well," I answered, "you shall have it." "I understand, of course," said he, "that you are not saying this on your own authority." "Oh, no," said I am saying it on the authority of the President." Well, these men voted that Nevada be allowed to form a state government, and thus they helped secure the vote which was required. The next October, the President signed the proclamation admitting the state. In the February following, Nevada was one of the states which ratified the 13th Amendment, by which slavery was abolished by constitutional prohibition in all of the United States. I have always felt that this little piece of side politics was one of the most judicious, humane, and wise uses of executive authority that I have ever assisted in or witnessed. The appointment in the New York Customs House was to wait until the term of the actual incumbent had run out. My friend, the Democratic congressman, was quite willing. "That's all right," he said. "I am in no hurry." Before the time had expired, Mr. Lincoln was murdered and Andrew Johnson became president. I was in the West when one day I got a telegram from Roscoe Conkling. "Come to Washington." So I went. "I want you to go and see President Johnson," Mr. Conkling said, "and tell him that the appointment of this man to the Custom House is a sacred promise of Mr. Lincoln's, and that it must be kept." Then I went to the White House and saw President Johnson. "This is Mr. Lincoln's promise," I urged. He regarded it as saving the necessity of another call for troops and raising perhaps 1,000,000 more men to continue the war. I trust, Mr. President, that you will see your way clear to execute this promise. "Well, Mr. Dana," he replied, "I don't say that I won't, but I have observed in the course of my experience that such bargains tend to immorality." The appointment was not made. I am happy to say, however, that the gentleman to whom the promise was given never found any fault either with President Lincoln or with the Assistant Secretary who had been the means of making the promise to him. One of the cleverest minor political moves which Mr. Lincoln ever made was an appointment he once gave Horace Greeley. Mr. Greeley never approved of Mr. Lincoln's manner of conducting the war, and he sometimes abused the president roundly for his deliberation. As the war went on, Greeley grew more and more irritable because the administration did not make peace on some terms. Finally, in July 1864, he received a letter from a pretended agent of the Confederate authorities in Canada saying, "I am authorized to state to you for our use only, not the public, that 2 ambassadors of Davis and Company are now in Canada with full and complete powers for a peace, and Mr. Sanders requests that you come on immediately to meet at Cataract House to have a private interview, or if you will send the President's protection for him and 2 friends, they will come on and meet you. He says the whole matter can be consummated by me, them, and President Lincoln." This letter was followed the next day by a telegram saying, "Will you come here? Parties have full power." Upon receiving the letter, Mr. Greeley wrote to President Lincoln, more or less in the strain of the articles that he had published in the Tribune. He complained bitterly of the way the business of the government was managed in the great crisis, and told the President that now there was a way open to peace. He explained that the Confederates wanted a conference, and he told Mr. Lincoln that he thought that he ought to appoint an ambassador or a diplomatic agent of the United States government to meet the Confederate agents at Niagara and hear what they had to say. Mr. Lincoln immediately responded by asking Mr. Greeley to be himself the representative and to go to Niagara Falls. "If you can find any person anywhere," the President wrote, "professing to have any proposition of Jefferson Davis, in writing, for peace, embracing the restoration of the Union and abandonment of slavery, whatever else it embraces, say to him he may come to me with you, and that if he really brings such proposition, he shall at the least have safe conduct with the paper and without publicity, if he chooses, to the point where you shall have met him. The same if there be 2 or more persons." Mr. Greeley went to Niagara, but his mission ended in nothing, except that the poor man, led astray by too great confidence, failed in his undertaking and was almost universally laughed at. I saw the President not long after that, and he said, with a funny twinkle in his eye, "I sent Brother Greeley a commission. I guess I am about even with him now." Lincoln had the most comprehensive, the most judicious mind. He was the least faulty in his conclusions of any man I have ever known. He never stepped too soon, and he never stepped too late. When the whole northern country seemed to be clamoring for him to issue a proclamation abolishing slavery, he didn't do it. Deputation after deputation went to Washington. I remember once 100 gentlemen dressed in black coats, mostly clergymen from Massachusetts, came to Washington to appeal to him to proclaim the abolition of slavery. But he did not do it. He allowed Mr. Cameron and General Butler to execute their great idea of treating slaves as contraband of war and protecting those who had got into our lines against being recaptured by their Southern owners, but he would not prematurely make the proclamation that was so much desired. Finally the time came, and of that he was the judge. Nobody else decided it. Nobody commanded it. The proclamation was issued as he thought best, and it was efficacious. The people of the North, who during the long contest over slavery had always stood strenuously by the compromises of the Constitution, might themselves have become half rebels if the proclamation had been issued too soon. At last they were tired of waiting, tired of endeavoring to preserve even a show of regard for what was called the compromises of the Constitution, when they believed the Constitution itself was in danger. Thus public opinion was ripe when the proclamation came, and that was the beginning of the end. He could have issued this proclamation 2 years before, perhaps, and the consequence of it might have been our entire defeat. But when it came, it did its work, and it did us no harm whatever. Nobody protested against it, not even the Confederates themselves. This unerring judgment, this patience which waited, and which knew when the right time had arrived, is an intellectual quality that I do not find exercised upon any such scale and with such absolute precision by any other man in history. It proves Abraham Lincoln to have been intellectually one of the greatest of rulers. If we look through the record of great men, where is there one to be placed beside him? I do not know. Another interesting fact about Abraham Lincoln is that he developed into a great military man. That is to say, a man of supreme military judgment. I do not risk anything in saying that if one will study the records of the war and study the writings relating to it, he will agree with me that the greatest general we had, greater than Grant or Thomas, was Abraham Lincoln. It was not so at the beginning, but after 3 or 4 years of constant practice in the science and art of war, he arrived at this extraordinary knowledge of it, so that von Moltke was not a better general, or an abler planner, or expounder of a campaign than was President Lincoln. To sum it up, he was a born leader of men. He knew human nature, he knew what chord to strike, and was never afraid to strike it when he believed that the time had arrived. Mr. Lincoln was not what is called an educated man. In the college that he attended, a man gets up at daylight to hoe corn and sits up at night by the side of a burning pine knot to read the best book he can find. What education he had picked up. He had read a great many books, and all the books that he had read he knew. He had a tenacious memory, just as he had the ability to see the essential thing. He never took an unimportant point and went off upon that, but he always laid hold of the real question and attended to that, giving no more thought to other points than was indispensably necessary. Thus, while we say that Mr. Lincoln was an uneducated man in the college sense, he had a singularly perfect education in regard to everything that concerns the practical affairs of life. His judgment was excellent, and his information was always accurate. He knew what the thing was. He was a man of genius, and contrasted with men of education, the man of genius will always carry the day. Many of his speeches illustrate this. I remember very well Mr. Stanton's comment on the Gettysburg speeches of Edward Everett and Mr. Lincoln. Edward Everett has made a speech, he said, that will make 3 columns in the newspapers, and Mr. Lincoln has made a speech of perhaps 40 or 50 lines. Everett's is the speech of a scholar, polished to the last possibility. It is elegant and it is learned. But Lincoln's speech will be read by 1,000 men where one reads Everett's, and will be remembered as long as anybody's speeches are remembered who speaks in the English language. That was the truth. Whoever thinks of or reads Everett's Gettysburg speech now? If one will compare those 2 speeches, he will get an idea how superior genius is to education, how superior the intellectual faculty is which sees the vitality of a question and knows how to state it, how superior the intellectual faculty is which regards everything with the fire of earnestness in the soul, with the relentless purpose of a heart devoted to objects beyond literature. Another remarkable peculiarity of Mr. Lincoln's was that he seemed to have no illusions. He had no freakish notions that things were so or might be so when they were not so. All his thinking and reasoning, all his mind, in short, was based continually upon actual facts, and upon facts of which, as I said, he saw the essence. I never heard him say anything that was not so. I never heard him foretell things. He told what they were. But I never heard him intimate that such and such consequences were likely to happen without the consequences following. I should say perhaps that his greatest quality was wisdom, and that is something superior to talent, superior to education. It is again genius. I do not think it can be acquired. All the advice that he gave was wise, and it was always timely. This wisdom, it is scarcely necessary to add, had its animating philosophy in his own famous words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all. Another remarkable quality of Mr. Lincoln was his great mercifulness. A thing it seemed as if he could not do was to sign a death warrant. One day General Augur, who was the Major General commanding the forces in and around Washington, came to my office and said, "Here is so-and-so, a spy. He has been tried by court-martial. The facts are perfectly established. He has been sentenced to death, and here is the warrant for his execution, which is fixed for tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. The President is away. If he were here, the man certainly wouldn't be executed. He isn't here. I think it's very essential to the safety of the service and the safety of everything that an example should be made of this spy. They do us great mischief, and it is very important that the law, which all nations recognize in dealing with spies, and punishment which every nation assigns to them, should be inflicted upon at least one of these wretches who haunt us around Washington. Do you know whether the President will be back before morning?" "I understand that he won't be back until tomorrow afternoon," I replied. "Well, as the President is not here, will you sign the warrant?" "Go to Mr. Stanton," I said. "He is the authority." "I have been to him, and he said I should come to you." Well, I signed the order. I agreed with General Augur in his view of the question. At about 11 o'clock the next day, I met the general. "The President got home at 2 o'clock this morning," he said, "and he stopped it all." But it was not only in matters of life and death that Mr. Lincoln was merciful. He was kind at heart toward all the world. I never heard him say an unkind thing about anybody. Now and then he would laugh at something jocose or satirical that somebody had done or said, but it was always pleasant humor. He would never allow the wants of any man or woman to go unattended if he could help it. I noticed his sweetness of nature, particularly with his little son, a child at that time perhaps 7 or 9 years old, who used to roam the departments and whom everybody called Tad. He had a defective palate and couldn't speak very plainly. Often I have sat by his father, reporting to him some important matter that I had been ordered to inquire into, and he would have this boy on his knee. While he would perfectly understand the report, the striking thing about him was his affection for the child. He was good to everybody. Once there was a great gathering at the White House on New Year's Day, and all the diplomats came in their uniforms, and all the officers of the Army and Navy in Washington were in full costume. A little girl of mine said, "Papa, couldn't you take me over to see that?" I said, "Yes." So I took her over and put her in a corner where she beheld this gorgeous show. When it was finished, I went up to Mr. Lincoln and said, "I have a little girl here who wants to shake hands with you." He went over to her and took her up and kissed her and talked to her. She will never forget it if she lives to be 1,000 years old. The end of chapter 12.